Welcome to our mid-year performance. We're lucky to be able to keep this going here, despite everything else. So we'll consider this a privilege and an honor to be able to stand here and still make some music, despite what's going on outside there. So the first piece we're going to play is a little cut down of the first movement of Beethoven's 6th Symphony, the Pastoral. Okay, so inadvertently this concert, I programmed a classical era concert. So one of the things that we learned, and maybe this is knowledge for you all, there's classical music, European Russian classical music, which is for a long time been called Western classical. West and East is relative. European and Russian classical music. And so, there's many, many eras. When you talk about all of it, there's before the Baroque era, there's the Baroque era, which is people like Bach, Handel, Corelli, Vivaldi. The classical era, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and as we introduced at the last concert, St. George, another one. And then you have the Romantic era, which is like late Beethoven, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and then you get a whole lot of different strains of music that's gone on from there. And the point I'm saying is inadvertently I programmed a classical era concert, so we're doing those that have, to this point, been known as the big three names in the classical era, incidentally. So the next piece is by Haydn, and he wrote 104 symphonies. He lived a good long time as compared to Mozart, who only lived 35 years. So this is from his 16th symphony, 1/6, in case it wasn't clear through the mass. And it's the final movement of it, the third movement, though we're playing it as a middle one here. And one of the things about Haydn in his construction of composition, being called the father of the symphony, he ultimately created what we see as a symphony of music, not like a symphony orchestra, but the piece of music called a symphony. Starts with some sort of fast movement, has a middle movement, which is typically a slow movement, and then a third movement that's a fast movement. That got expanded by Mozart and later in time, later in the classical era, into 4 movements and so on in the future. So, but what was really distinct about Haydn's earlier music is that it's not so much of, you know, when we think of maybe into Beethoven and after where you have these melodies and then the orchestra playing around it, like what we just listened to, this wonderful melody, and then all this stuff happening around it. Haydn took rhythmic phrases, rhythmic bits, rhythmic concepts and ideas, and used it to create the overall music. Now, a very famous piece that you've heard of and probably know that did exactly that is Beethoven's Fifth. Da 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 da, right? And you take that theme and you have it in the second movement, it appears in the third movement, and it brings back a little bit in the fourth movement about how it's constructed, but this particular rhythmic theme ties the whole thing together. Well, in this particular movement, if you listen really closely to the rhythms, you'll only hear 1 or 2 or 3 different rhythms across the whole piece of music. And he uses that to construct this really wonderful thing. So that was how early symphonies were constructed, which of course, you know, as we get far later into, you know, I'm playing a piece up in Folsom by Richard Strauss. This is the depth of romantic music where it doesn't feel like there's ever a beginning to an end or an end to it. It just keeps going and going and going and splashes somewhere and then lands over there. And then you climb a mountain and you're like, hello, and all this stuff, right? Strauss. It's a little different than this. Okay, anyways, I told him I wouldn't talk too much and I apparently was not being honest. Thank you. These kids have done an amazing job this year. Really, these last couple of years, despite everything working against us in the music industry on some really intense levels, obviously, we're still able to have music. Something that can help us kind of just release a little bit, right? So, what's I think most impressive, not just that these guys are doing as well as they are, but that this particular concert, we only had 7 or 8, I think 8 rehearsals. Normally we do about 10 or 11 rehearsals, but because of finding facilities, all the stuff going on, the stuff you don't see behind the scenes where you have Robert working his tail off trying to find us a place to play, which has happened for a while. It's a lot. So, that they only had 8 weeks to pull off this level of music is incredible. A couple more weeks is probably what we normally would do. And what they've been able to do to this point with music that's really quite complicated from the ability level that many of these students started in at the beginning of the year. They're doing brilliantly. And to pull this off in 8 weeks is really something special. So I just want to make note of that because I'm really impressed by it. So, and then one last thing before I forget, since I just remembered, we have a couple people helping join us here. We did a little rearranging with the group and ended up with just violins and cellos. And so we welcome a couple people. This is Chris from Premier over on bass. So yay, Chris. And over in the viola section, we have one of our parents here. Thank you. And as well, we have 2 students from Premier, right? You're both academic. Academic and Premier. What, I was right? Oh, good, I was right. Doesn't happen that often, believe me. Philip and Aaron here, and so thank you guys. Okay, so our last tune here is one by Mozart, and this is not one that otherwise I think ever gets played anywhere and anyone's ever heard of. But someone about 75 years ago, or however long it was, decided to put this into an arrangement. It's a quartet that comes from one of the string serenades. And it's the finale. It's called the Post Horn, which I have probably means something. But long story short, this is a really neat piece. And you can hear how, compared to the Haydn, where you could hear those few little rhythms through the whole thing, right? That here we start, Mozart starts to take in his later music like this, much more in depth with using those rhythms and then developing them as they go and using them in ways that are different than keeping it as consistent as that piece by Haydn did. So you'll be able to hear some of the same kind of strains of like the rhythm in there, but you'll also hear how he takes it to a much different place and expands upon it much more than Haydn did in his piece. So this is Serenade number 9 finale, and this is our last piece for the day, so thank you very much.